There are sounds that make a man stop in his tracks. A gunshot is one. A woman crying is another. But the sound of flesh hitting flesh when the strong beat the weak? That's the sound Bear Hutchins never walked past. It was August of 1883 in Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, and the sun was setting like liquid copper over the Superstition Mountains. Caleb Hutchins, 42 years of hard living and harder choices, rode his Appaloosa down from the high country with dust coating his long red-brown beard and exhaustion sitting heavy on his broad shoulders. His Kentucky rifle rested across his back, and in his saddlebag sat an $800 bounty poster for a man called Rattlesnake Jack Donovan. Bear had come to this miserable mining town for one reason: information. His contact, an old Texas Ranger named Sam Brennan, supposedly drank whiskey every evening at the Dusty Saloon and knew where outlaws hid in these mountains. Simple enough. Get the information, collect the bounty, move on. Bear had been moving on for 5 years now, ever since the night his wife Sarah and his 6-year-old daughter Emily had died in a fire while he chased money and justice through the Tennessee hills. But then came that sound. Thwack! Sharp and cruel, echoing off the false front buildings of Copper Ridge's main street. Bear's hand tightened on the reins, his ice-blue eyes, the kind that had seen too much death to be comfortable with life, fixed on the broken window of Thorne's General Store. Through the jagged glass, he could see it all as clear as the hatred rising in his chest. A fat man, sweating through an expensive vest despite the evening cool, stood over a young woman who knelt on the wooden floor. She was picking up shards of broken turquoise, pieces of what had once been a decorative box, and her hands trembled as blood dripped from her split lip onto the floorboards. Her left eye was already swelling purple, but her face held no tears, just a terrible, quiet dignity that Bear recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who had survived so much that one more beating barely registered. The fat man, Ezekiel Thorne, according to the faded paint on the store sign, was shouting. Bear couldn't hear the words through the glass, but he didn't need to. He'd seen enough bullies in his 42 years to know the script. Blame, punishment, cruelty dressed up as righteousness. Bear told himself to ride on. Not your business, Stone. You came for a bounty, not trouble. But his hand was already moving toward his Colt revolver before his mind caught up with his body. 5 years of hunting dangerous men had taught him to mind his own business, to stay alive by staying uninvolved. But something about the girl's calm strength felt familiar in a way that twisted painfully in his chest. She wore a turquoise necklace, a single stone on a silver chain, and it gleamed against her throat the same way Sarah's had, the same color, the same quiet beauty in the middle of ugliness. Bear dismounted. His boots hit the dusty street, and he was already walking toward the store before he'd made the conscious decision to intervene. Through the window, he watched the girl reach for another piece of broken stone. Thorne raised his hand again. The girl didn't flinch. She just kept working, kept moving, kept surviving. Bear pushed the door open. The bell above it chimed with an innocent cheerfulness that didn't match the scene inside. Thorne's hand froze in mid-swing. His florid face turned toward the doorway, annoyance flashing across his features before something else took its place when he saw the size of the man filling his doorframe. Bear Hutchins stood 6 feet 2 inches, built like the mountains he called home, with shoulders that came from hauling timber and arms that came from wrestling with nature itself. His beard was wild and unkempt, his hair hung past his collar, and a long scar ran from his hairline down across his left cheek, a gift from a grizzly when he was 16. He looked exactly like what he was, dangerous, experienced, and utterly unafraid. "Step away from her," Bear said. His voice was low, almost conversational, which somehow made it more menacing than if he'd shouted. Thorne puffed up, trying to make himself bigger. "Who the hell are you? Get out of my store!" "I said step away." Bear's hand rested on his Colt. Not threatening, just present. Just there. Thorne glanced at the gun and took one step back. "This is my property. She's my worker. This doesn't concern you." Bear's eyes moved to the girl. She had stopped picking up the broken pieces and was staring at him with dark brown eyes that held intelligence, pain, and something he couldn't quite name. Not hope. Not yet. Just calculation. She was trying to figure out if this stranger was going to make her situation better or worse. Property, Bear repeated, letting the words sit in the air like something rotten. I don't see any property marks on her skin. I only see a fat man beating a girl. Thorne's face went from red to purple. She broke a $50 turquoise box. Clumsy half-breed doesn't know her place. The girl stood then, slowly, gracefully, with a dignity that Thorne's words couldn't touch. She was 19, maybe 20. Apache if Bear was reading the signs right. Slender but strong, with long black hair pulled back in a single braid and wearing a plain brown dress that had been mended a dozen times. The turquoise necklace at her throat caught the last rays of sunlight through the window. "That's enough," Bear said, and now his voice had dropped another level, into that dangerous quiet that men who'd seen real violence recognized. "The girl's coming with me." Thorne grabbed a hammer from the counter. "I'll crack your skull, mountain man." Bear's rifle came off his shoulder in one smooth motion. The barrel pointed at the floor between them, but the message clear. "I know 47 ways to use that hammer without killing you, but I only need 3 seconds to shoot your kneecaps out. Choose." Thorne's hand shook. The hammer clattered back onto the counter. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." "Won't be the first time." Bear glanced at the girl and switched to Apache, the dialect he'd learned from his father, who'd lived 10 years with the Cherokee before meeting Bear's mother. "Shima hadidaiwe?" "Mother, are you badly hurt?" The girl's eyes widened in shock. A white man speaking her language, speaking it correctly. "Ow! But why?" "Why do you speak in D language?" "Yes. But why do you speak the people's language?" "Learned from my pa," Bear said in English now, keeping his rifle ready but his voice gentle. "He said a man who can't talk to his neighbors ain't worth much." He moved toward her slowly, giving her space to refuse, to run, to make her own choice. But she didn't move away. She picked up a small cloth bag from behind the counter, the kind that held personal belongings, and walked toward him with her head high despite the blood on her lip. Thorne's voice came from behind them, thick with rage. "You just declared war, stranger. This town belongs to me and my brother. You'll regret this." Bear didn't turn around. He kept his body between the girl and Thorne, walking her toward the door with his rifle still ready. "Tell your brother to come find me. I'll be at Grace Hartwell's boarding house." They stepped into the evening air. The girl stumbled slightly, exhaustion and pain catching up with her now that adrenaline was fading. Bear caught her elbow, steadying her, then immediately let go when she was stable, respecting her space, not claiming her. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. "I've walked through worse," she said. Her English was good, barely accented, though her voice was rough from whatever she'd endured before he arrived. "Who are you?" "Caleb Hutchins. Folks call me Bear on account of I live in the mountains and don't talk much." He glanced back at Thorne's store, where the fat man stood in the doorway, watching with murderous eyes. "What's your name?" "Najoni." She touched the turquoise at her throat. "It means beautiful. Ironic, isn't it?" She gestured at her swollen face with dark humor that surprised him. Bear looked at her straight on, his weathered face serious. "No, ma'am. Still fits." Something shifted in her eyes then. Not trust. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The seed of possibility that maybe, just maybe, this stranger was different from the other men who'd made promises and broken them. They walked through the dusty streets of Copper Ridge as the sun painted everything gold and crimson. A few townspeople watched from porches and doorways, their faces showing shame, curiosity, fear. Everyone knew what Ezekiel Thorne did to the Apache girl in his store. Everyone knew, and no one had stopped it. Grace Hartwell's boarding house sat at the edge of town, a two-story building with a wraparound porch and curtains in the windows that suggested someone still cared about making a place feel like home. The widow who owned it met them at the door, a woman of 55 with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough of life's cruelties to recognize courage when she saw it. "Bear Hutchins," Grace said, her voice carrying the accent of educated Boston mixed with 20 years of Arizona frontier. "I heard you'd come to town, and I see you've already made an enemy of our most powerful citizen." "Didn't set out to," Bear said, "but some things a man can't walk past." Grace looked at Najoni, at the blood and bruises, and her face softened. "Come in, child. Let's get you cleaned up." She led them inside to a small room on the first floor, brought warm water and clean bandages, then left them alone with a meaningful look that said she knew what happened next mattered. Bear stood at the door, not quite in the room, not quite out. "I'll wait out here. You need privacy." Najoni, sitting on the edge of the bed, touched her swollen face gingerly. "You can come in. I've had worse than this." He stepped inside but kept his distance, kneeling down so he was at eye level with her rather than looming above. He took the cloth Grace had left, dampened it in the basin, and reached toward her face slowly, giving her time to refuse. She didn't. He cleaned the blood from her lip with gentle hands that seemed too large for such delicate work. "You don't have to be gentle," Najoni said. "I won't break." "No, ma'am," Bear replied quietly. "But just because you can take pain don't mean you should." She studied his face as he worked, taking in the scar, the weathered skin, the eyes that looked older than his years. "Why are you helping me?" Bear paused, the cloth still against her cheek. The question hung in the air between them like smoke. He could have lied, could have given her something easy and comfortable. Instead, he gave her truth. 5 years ago, I had a wife, Sarah, and a daughter named Emily, 6 years old. I left them one night to chase a bounty through the Tennessee mountains, 3-day job for $500. When I got back, the house was burned to the ground. The men I was hunting had come for revenge while I was gone. Sarah and Emily died in that fire. Najoni's eyes softened, but she didn't look away. "And you think saving me will save them?" "No." Bear went back to cleaning her wounds. "But maybe it'll help me sleep at night. Maybe it'll mean their deaths taught me something about what matters. I don't want to be your redemption, mountain man." "Good," Bear said, meeting her eyes again. "Because I don't need redemption. I just need to do what's right." Grace returned then with bread, cheese, and coffee. Najoni ate like someone who hadn't had a full meal in days, which Bear suspected was exactly the case. He ate too, but left the larger portions for her, pushing the food across the small table without comment. "Thorne won't let this go," Grace said, sitting in the room's only chair. "Ezekiel owns half this town, Bear. His brother Jonas is the U.S. Marshal for this territory. Together they control everything. The sheriff, the judge, the businesses. Anyone who crosses them tends to disappear or worse." "Why has no one helped her before now?" Bear asked, though he already knew the answer. He'd seen this pattern before. Fear was a powerful silencer. Grace's face showed shame. Because she's Apache. Because she's poor. Because this town turns a blind eye when the person suffering doesn't look like them. But she's a good girl, Bear. Too good for what she's been through. Najoni finished eating and looked at Bear directly. "You saved me from one beating. That doesn't change that I belong to Thorne. He bought me from my people 2 years ago when they needed medicine during the cholera outbreak. I'm bound to him until the debt is paid." "How much?" Bear asked. $300, plus interest, plus room and board, plus whatever he decides I owe him for broken merchandise." Her voice was flat, factual, reciting numbers she'd heard 1,000 times. "By his calculation, I'll be 80 before I'm free." Bear's jaw tightened. "That's not a debt. That's slavery. And slavery's been illegal since 1865. "Not for Indians," Najoni said with bitter accuracy. "Not in places like this. Not when the law is owned by men like Thorne." Bear stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening street. Somewhere in his mind, a plan was forming. Not just rescue, something bigger, something that would make a difference. "What if we could prove Thorne's breaking more than just moral laws?" he said, turning back to face the women. "What if we could get evidence that would interest federal authorities? Real authorities, not local badges he's bought?" Najoni's eyes narrowed with interest. "What kind of evidence?" "Tell me," Bear said, moving back to sit across from her. "In the 2 years you've worked for Thorne, what have you seen? What does he do that the law would care about?" She thought for a moment, then spoke carefully. "He keeps ledgers, in his office behind a painting of his mother, records of every transaction. Copper ore he sells without paying taxes, supplies he charges the government for but never delivers. And something else. Men come at night sometimes. Rough men. Outlaws, I think. They meet with Thorne in the back room. I hear talk of guns, stolen army rifles being sold." Bear's instincts, honed from years of hunting dangerous men, lit up like a torch. Gun running. That was federal jurisdiction. That was something even a corrupt territorial marshal couldn't easily dismiss. "Can you get to those ledgers?" he asked. "Maybe. If I had help. If someone created a distraction." She leaned forward. "But why would you risk this? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." "No," Bear agreed. "But I know right from wrong, and I know that sometimes one person standing up is all it takes to start something bigger." A knock at the door interrupted them. Grace answered it, then stepped back to let in an older man with a limp and a face that had seen hard years. This was Sam Brennan, the man Bear had come to find, looking every bit of his 68 years with his silver mustache and the badge he'd once worn as a Texas Ranger pinned to his vest out of habit rather than authority. "Bear Hutchins," Sam said, his voice gravelly but strong. "I heard you made enemy number 1 in town tonight." "Seems I did. You're Sam Brennan. I was coming to find you." "Well, you found me, and I'm guessing you want to know about Rattlesnake Jack." Sam looked at Najoni with kind eyes. "But first, let's talk about this young lady. Najoni, the whole town knows what Thorne's been doing to you. Shame on us for not stopping it sooner." "You can help stop it now," Najoni said with quiet strength. Sam pulled up a chair, sat down with a wince that spoke of old wounds, and listened as Bear explained what they'd learned. When Bear finished, Sam nodded slowly. "Thorne's not just a store owner. He's the middleman for a gun-running operation. Rattlesnake Jack, the man you're hunting, steals rifles from Army depots. Thorne sells them to Apache renegades, Mexican bandits, anyone with cash. Marshal Jonas covers it all up." "And you know this how?" Bear asked. "Because I've been gathering evidence for 6 months," Sam said. "Waiting for the right moment, the right person to help me take it all down. I'm too old and too broken to do it alone. But you—" He looked at Bear with assessment. "You're exactly what I've been waiting for." "And the girl?" Bear indicated Najoni. Sam smiled. "She's smarter than all of us. If she knows where Thorne keeps his records, we've got everything we need." They spent the next hour planning. It wasn't elaborate. The best plans never were. Sam would create a distraction at 9 that evening by setting fire to some hay bales at the end of the street. The 2 guards Thorne kept at the store at night, men named Clem and Dutch, would go investigate. Bear and Najoni would enter through the back, open the safe using the combination Najoni had memorized from watching Thorne, and take the ledgers. Simple, dangerous, necessary. As 9 o'clock approached, Bear checked his rifle and revolver. Najoni watched him work with the careful attention of someone learning survival skills. "Have you ever killed a man?" she asked quietly. Bear's hands paused on the rifle. "Yes. Many. More than I wanted. Fewer than I could have." He looked at her. "I don't kill for pleasure, if that's what you're asking. Only when there's no other choice." "The men who killed your family, did you find them?" "Yes. All 3. Grissom brothers. Tracked them for 2 years. Found them in New Mexico. Bear's voice went flat, emotionless. Killed them all. Didn't bring Sarah and Emily back. Didn't make me feel better. Just made me empty. Najoni touched his arm briefly. Revenge doesn't heal. But maybe justice does. Maybe, Bear agreed, surprised by her wisdom. At 9, they moved. Sam's distraction worked perfectly. Flames and shouts drew Clem and Dutch away from the store. Bear and Najoni slipped through the back door using a key Najoni had copied months ago, planning for an escape she'd never had the courage to attempt alone. Inside Thorne's office, lit only by moonlight through the window, Najoni moved with confidence born of 2 years observing every detail. She found the painting of Thorne's stern-faced mother, lifted it off the wall, and revealed the safe behind it. 14/7/23, she whispered, turning the dial. His mother's birthday. Men like Thorne think they're clever, but they're predictable. The safe clicked open. Inside lay a thick ledger, papers, and a bag of gold coins. Bear reached for the ledger, but his hand stopped when he saw Najoni looking at the gold. "Take it," he said softly. "You've earned it." She shook her head. "No, we're not thieves. We're people seeking justice. There's a difference." Bear felt something shift in his chest at her words. This girl, this young woman who'd been beaten and enslaved, still held on to principles that most men lost by 30. She was stronger than he was in ways that had nothing to do with muscles or guns. He was about to say something when lights blazed throughout the store. Ezekiel Thorne stepped out from the back room, followed by 4 armed men Bear had never seen before. Not Clem and Dutch. These were professional gunmen, hard-faced and experienced. "Did you think I was stupid?" Thorne's voice dripped satisfaction. "Grace Hartwell told me everything. The widow owes me $2,000. She had no choice but to inform me of your plan." Bear's mind raced. Betrayed. They'd been set up. His hand moved toward his gun, but 4 rifles were already pointed at him and Najoni. Then came the sound that changed everything. A shotgun blast from outside, 2 shots, men shouting. Men. "That wasn't part of the plan," Thorne said, confusion crossing his face. The door burst open. Sam Brennan stood there, shotgun smoking, breathing hard. "Actually, it was. My plan. Run, Bear. I've got them." Bear didn't hesitate. He grabbed Najoni, pulled her toward the window. Glass shattered as they crashed through onto the street. Behind them, more gunfire erupted. Sam was buying them time with his life. They ran through alleys, past startled citizens, heading for the livery stable where Bear had left his horse. Behind them, shouts and gunfire echoed through Copper Ridge. The night that had started with a simple plan had exploded into chaos. At the stable, gasping for breath, Najoni turned to Bear. "Grace betrayed us? Or Sam discovered the trap and warned us the only way he could?" Bear was saddling 2 horses now, working fast. "Either way, we can't stay here." "Where do we go?" Bear met her eyes. In the lamplight of the stable he could see the fear there, but also determination. This girl refused to break. "White Mountain Apache Reservation, 40 miles east. Your people. They'll protect you while we figure out what comes next." "My people won't trust a white man." "Then you better vouch for me." Najoni smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, made her look young again despite everything she'd endured. "I will. But Bear, if we do this, if we run together, we're bound together. My fight becomes your fight." "I figured that out the moment I walked into Thorne's store," Bear said. He handed her the reins of a strong mare. "Can you ride?" "I'm Apache. Of course I can ride." "Good, because we need to move fast." They mounted and were about to ride when Sam Brennan limped into the stable, bleeding from his thigh, but alive. "Go!" he shouted. "Jonas is coming. I'll slow them down." "Sam, come with us," Bear said. The old ranger shook his head. I'm 68 and shot through the leg. I'd only slow you down. Besides, someone needs to stay and keep eyes on these bastards." He gripped Bear's hand with surprising strength. "You've been running from living for 5 years, boy. Maybe it's time you run toward something instead of away from ghosts." Those words hit harder than any bullet. Bear nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Then he and Najoni rode into the night, leaving Copper Ridge behind with all its corruption and cruelty. As they galloped toward the mountains under a sky full of stars, Bear thought about the question Najoni had asked earlier. Why was he helping her? The easy answer was guilt over Sarah and Emily. But the truth he was just beginning to understand, was simpler and more profound. He was helping her because for the first time in 5 years, he felt alive again. Not just surviving, actually living. And that scared him more than any gun ever could. Beside him, Najoni rode like she was born to it, her long braids streaming behind her, her face set with determination toward the freedom that lay 40 miles ahead. She'd been a victim when he found her. By the time they reached her people, she'd be something else entirely. And so would he. The mountain was coming down from his lonely peaks. The wind was learning to trust again. And somewhere in the darkness behind them, justice was gathering its forces for a reckoning that would shake Copper Ridge to its foundations. The desert night swallowed them whole as Bear and Najoni rode east from Copper Ridge, their horses' hooves drumming a desperate rhythm against packed earth. Behind them, the mining town glowed like a dying ember in the darkness. Ahead lay 40 miles of Arizona territory that could kill the unprepared and certainly would kill anyone Marshal Jonas Thorne caught running from his corrupted justice. Bear kept his Appaloosa at a steady gallop, but his eyes constantly scanned their back trail. The moon hung fat and silver in the sky, blessing them with light to ride by, but cursing them with visibility for anyone pursuing. Beside him, Najoni rode with the natural grace of someone raised on horseback, her body moving with the mare's rhythm as if they were one creature. They didn't speak for the first hour. Speech required breath they couldn't spare, and besides, there was nothing to say that the pounding hooves weren't already communicating. They were running. They were alive. That was enough. When they finally slowed at a bend in the trail where massive boulders offered cover, Bear dismounted and checked their surroundings with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent decades reading terrain for threats. Najoni slid from her saddle with barely a sound, moving to check her horse with gentle hands that spoke of genuine care for the animal. "You know horses," Bear observed, his voice rough from dust and exertion. "My father bred them before the soldiers came." Najoni ran her fingers along the mare's flank, checking for injury. "He said a good horse is worth 10 good men. A great horse is worth an army." Smart man. He was, until a cavalry lieutenant decided he wanted our herd more than we deserved to keep it. Her voice carried no bitterness, just the flat recitation of facts too painful to color with emotion. "They shot him when he refused. My mother never recovered from watching it." Bear handed her his canteen. She drank sparingly, then returned it. Their fingers touched briefly in the exchange, and neither pulled away as quickly as they might have. Something was building between them, fragile as spider silk and twice as easily broken, but undeniably present. "We should keep moving," Bear said, though he knew the horses needed rest. "Jonas won't wait for morning." "Neither should we." Najoni remounted with fluid ease. "But Bear, thank you, for not leaving me behind when you could have." "Wasn't an option," he said simply, and kicked his Appaloosa back into motion. They rode through canyons painted silver by moonlight, past saguaro cacti that stood like sentinels marking their passage. The air cooled as they climbed toward the foothills of the Pinal Mountains, and somewhere in the darkness, a coyote sang its lonely song to the indifferent stars. At 2 in the morning, they stopped by a spring that bubbled from between rocks, creating a small pool that reflected the moon like liquid mercury. The horses drank gratefully while Bear and Najoni knelt upstream, cupping water to their mouths and splashing it on faces gritty with dust and dried sweat. Najoni moved away from the spring and began gathering plants that grew along the rocky bank. Even in the darkness, her hands moved with certainty, selecting stems and leaves with the confidence of knowledge passed down through generations. "Bitter root," she said, holding up one plant, "and yarrow, for wounds and fever." "Your mother taught you," Bear said. Not a question. Everything she knew. She was a healer in our camp. When the cholera came in '81, she tried to save everyone. She succeeded with most, but the sickness took her in the end. Najoni's hands paused in their work. Thorn came with medicine from a white doctor, real medicine that could have saved her if it had come sooner. He said my people owed him $300. We had no money, so he took me as payment. Bear's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "And your tribe let him?" "They had no choice. It was me or watch more people die." She returned to gathering herbs. "I went willingly, to save my people. That's what warriors do." "You're not a victim," Bear said, and meant it. "You're a warrior who did what needed doing." Najoni looked at him then, really looked at him, her dark eyes searching his face for deception or patronizing comfort. She found neither, only recognition, one warrior acknowledging another. "I haven't felt like a warrior for 2 years," she said softly, "until tonight." Bear started to respond, but movement on the ridge above froze the words in his throat. A rider, silhouetted against the stars. Then another. 3, total, moving slow, searching. "Thorn's men," Najoni whispered. "No talking. Follow me." Bear led them deeper into the rocks, away from the spring, into a narrow defile where the horses' bodies would be hidden by stone walls. They waited in absolute silence, barely breathing, while the riders passed 50 yards above them. When the hoofbeats faded, Najoni exhaled shakily. "They're between us and the reservation. Then we go around, through the high country." Bear pointed northeast where the mountains rose dark and forbidding. "Longer route, harder, but safer." "How do you know these mountains?" "I don't. But mountains are mountains. You read them like you'd read a map." He touched the rock beside him. "This stone tells me there's water higher up. These plants say the pass is crossable. The wind coming down smells of pine, which means forest beyond the ridge. We follow what the land tells us." Najoni smiled despite their danger. "My father said the same thing about the desert. The land speaks to those who listen." "Your father and my pa would have gotten along." They climbed through the darkness, leading their horses up trails that were barely more than suggestions in the rock face. It was slow, treacherous work, but it bought them distance from their pursuers. As dawn began to paint the eastern sky with streaks of gold and crimson, they crested a ridge and looked down into a valley where pine trees grew thick and a stream carved silver ribbons through green meadow. "We rest here," Bear decided. 2 hours. The horses need it, and so do we." They made camp without fire, not willing to risk the smoke. Bear tended the horses while Najoni used her gathered herbs to make a poultice for the bullet wound in his shoulder that he'd almost forgotten in the chaos of their escape. As she worked, peeling away his shirt to expose the injury, he studied her face in the growing light. She was beautiful, but it was a beauty earned through suffering rather than granted by chance. Her cheekbones were high and proud, her mouth expressive even when silent, her eyes ancient with knowledge no 19-year-old should possess. The bruises Thorn had given her were already fading to yellow and green, healing faster than they should, as if her body was as determined to move forward as her spirit. "This will sting," she warned, applying the yarrow paste. It did, but Bear didn't flinch. He'd learned long ago that showing pain only invited more of it. Najoni worked with gentle efficiency, her fingers cool against his skin, and when she finished, she sat back and regarded him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Tell me about your family," she said. "Not how they died, how they lived." The request caught him off guard. Most people wanted the tragic story, the drama of loss. She wanted the truth beneath it, so he gave it to her. Sarah was a school teacher from Knoxville, smart as a whip and twice as quick. She could quote Shakespeare and shoot a rifle and make bread that'd make you weep with joy. Bear's voice softened with memory. Emily was 6 when she died, but she was reading at a 10-year-old level, had Sarah's brains and my stubborn streak, used to follow me everywhere asking questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? Where do bears sleep in winter? What makes rocks different colors? And you answered her? Najoni asked. Every question, every single one. Even when I didn't know the answer, I'd help her figure it out. Bear's throat tightened. The night they died, she'd asked me why I had to leave. I told her it was to make money to keep us fed and safe. She said, "But Papa, we're already safe because you're here." And I left anyway. Najoni's hand found his, small and warm and alive. You couldn't have known. No, but that don't make it hurt less. Bear turned his hand over, interlacing their fingers. The Grissom brothers burned my house because I was hunting them. They killed my family to hurt me. And you know what the worst part is? They succeeded. For 5 years I've been dead inside, just going through motions. Until last night. What changed last night? Bear looked at her directly. I saw someone worth saving. And maybe, for the first time, I saw something worth living for, instead of just existing. Najoni leaned forward slowly, giving him time to move away if he wanted. He didn't. Their foreheads touched, breath mingling in the space between them, and for a moment the world contracted to just this: 2 broken people finding something whole in each other. Then the sharp crack of a rifle shot shattered the moment. The bullet hit a tree trunk 6 inches from Bear's head, spraying bark and splinters. They broke apart, Bear grabbing his rifle, Najoni rolling toward cover. 5 riders burst from the tree line, guns drawn, and Bear recognized one of them immediately. Rattlesnake Jack Donovan himself, the very man Bear had come to Copper Ridge to find, leading 4 hardened outlaws straight toward them. Jonas must have sent word ahead, using the very criminals his brother sold weapons to as his hunting pack. "Surrender the ledger," Jack's voice carried across the meadow. "We know you got it. Make this easy." Bear's response was to fire 3 quick shots that forced the riders to scatter and seek cover. Najoni already had her revolver out, the one Bear had given her and taught her to use in those brief hours at the boarding house. She might not have his experience, but her hand was steady and her eyes clear. "Can't fight them straight up," Bear said, reloading. "Too many, and they have position." "Then we don't fight straight." Najoni pointed to a rock slide area above the riders. "If we can get above them and trigger that, it'll block their path, buy us time. That's risky. Everything about this is risky." She met his eyes. "Trust me like I trusted you." Bear nodded. "Go. I'll keep them pinned." Najoni moved like smoke through the trees, using every scrap of cover, working her way upslope while Bear laid down suppressing fire that kept Rattlesnake Jack and his men focused on him rather than looking for a second threat. She was Apache, born to this kind of warfare, and she moved with the confidence of generations of warriors who'd fought impossible odds and survived. When she reached the rocks above the riders, she didn't hesitate. She fired 3 shots into the base of the unstable slope, then scrambled back as physics and gravity took over. Tons of rock and earth cascaded down in a thunderous avalanche that forced the outlaws to flee or be buried. One man wasn't fast enough. His horse screamed as rock crushed its legs. The rider went down hard. The others retreated in chaos, abandoning their wounded comrade and any thoughts of immediate pursuit. Bear and Najoni ran for their horses, mounted, and rode hard up the mountain trail while behind them the dust settled and angry shouts echoed off canyon walls. They'd won this round, but Bear knew it was just one battle in a longer war. They rode for 3 more hours, putting distance between themselves and danger until exhaustion forced another stop. This time, they found a defensible position in a box canyon with only one entrance that Bear could watch while Najoni and the horses rested. She was trembling when she finally stopped moving, the aftermath of adrenaline making her hands shake as she tried to unsaddle her mare. Bear took over the task gently, working with quiet efficiency while she sat on a flat rock and processed what she'd just done. "I triggered a rock slide that could have killed a man," she said, her voice small. "You saved our lives," Bear corrected. "What you did was brilliant and brave. Your father would be proud." "My father would say I should have killed them all." "Maybe. Or maybe he'd say you showed mercy by giving them a chance to run." Bear finished with the horses and sat beside her. "Najoni, you did what had to be done. No more, no less. That's the mark of a warrior with honor." She leaned against him, exhausted. "I'm not sure I want to be a warrior. I'm tired of fighting." "I know. Me too." Bear put his arm around her shoulders, feeling her warmth against his side. "But sometimes we don't get to choose. We just do what the moment requires, and hope we're still ourselves when it's over." They sat in silence as the sun climbed higher, warming the rock beneath them. Below, a hawk circled on thermal currents, hunting with patient grace. Above, clouds like torn cotton drifted across blue so deep it hurt to look at. "When this is over," Najoni said eventually, "what happens to us?" "Don't know," Bear admitted. "Haven't thought past survival." "Think past it now. For me," Bear considered. "I have a cabin in the White Mountains of North Carolina. Haven't been back in 5 years. Good land, clean water, peace and quiet." He paused. "Big enough for 2 if someone wanted to share it." Najoni turned to look at him. "Are you asking me to leave my people?" "No. I'm asking if you'd want to build something new while still honoring what you came from. You could visit your tribe whenever you wanted, but you'd have a home where nobody owns you and nobody hurts you." "That sounds like a dream." "Dreams are just plans that haven't happened yet." She smiled at that, then kissed him, quick and soft and gone before he could fully register it. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. "I need to think about it. After we reach my people, after we deal with Thorn, ask me again when the dust settles." "That's fair," Bear said, though his heart was pounding like he'd run up a mountain. They rested another hour, then mounted and continued toward the White Mountain Apache Reservation. The terrain grew harder, the air thinner, but their spirits lifted with each mile that separated them from Copper Ridge. They were still being hunted, still in danger, but they were moving forward together, and that made all the difference. As afternoon shadows lengthened into evening gold, they finally saw it. The valley where the White Mountain Apache made their home. Wickiups dotted the landscape, traditional dwellings that spoke of a people maintaining their ways despite everything the world had taken from them. Smoke rose from cooking fires, children played near a stream, women ground corn while men prepared for hunting. It looked like peace, it looked like home. But as Bear and Najoni rode down from the high country, warriors emerged from the camp, arrows nocked and rifles ready. At their head rode a young man of perhaps 26, muscular and proud, with eyes that burned with barely controlled fury when he saw Najoni accompanied by a white man. "Chaska," Najoni called out in Apache, "brother of my heart, I have returned." Chaska rode forward, his face torn between joy at seeing her alive and rage at her companion. "Najoni, we thought you dead or lost forever. And who is this Bilagayana?" The word, meaning white man, was spat like a curse. "This is Caleb Hutchins. He saved my life from Ezekiel Thorn." "Saved?" Chaska's hand rested on his knife. "Or captured?" Bear remained still in his saddle, hands visible, showing no threat. He'd been through this before with Cherokee elders in his youth. Show respect, show strength, but never show aggression unless attacked first. "Saved," Najoni said firmly. "Thorn beat me. This man intervened, risked his life. Thorn's men hunt us both now. We carry proof of Thorn's crimes." She produced the ledger from her saddlebag, proof that can destroy his power. More warriors had gathered now, a dozen armed men surrounding them. The tension was thick enough to choke on. One wrong word, one wrong move, and this could end in blood. Then an old voice cut through the standoff like a knife through silk. "Enough! Bring them to the council fire." An elderly man emerged from the largest wickiup, leaning on a carved walking stick, his white hair long and unbound, his face a map of wisdom earned through decades of hard living. This was Red Sky Walker, the medicine man, and his word carried the weight of generations. The warriors parted. Bear and Najoni dismounted and followed Red Sky Walker to a central area where a fire pit sat surrounded by smooth stones worn by countless council meetings. Other elders gathered, their faces showing curiosity, suspicion, and in some cases, hostility. Red Sky Walker settled himself with careful dignity, then fixed Bear with eyes that seemed to see straight through flesh and bone to whatever soul resided beneath. "Sit, mountain man. Speak truth, and you will be heard. Speak lies, and you will be judged." Bear sat cross-legged, keeping his hands visible and his bearing respectful. Najoni knelt beside him, ready to translate if needed, but Bear spoke first in halting Apache. "Honored grandfather, I come seeking shelter for one who has suffered injustice. Najoni is brave and strong. She deserves freedom. I ask your permission to remain while we plan how to bring justice to those who have hurt her and hurt your people." Red Sky Walker's eyebrows rose slightly at hearing Apache from a white man's mouth. "You know our tongue." "My father lived with Cherokee. He taught me that a man who cannot speak with his neighbors is no man at all." A long silence followed. Then Chaska stepped forward. "Words mean nothing. I challenge him. Apache way, no weapons. Let him prove his honor through strength." Najoni started to protest, but Bear stood calmly. "I accept, but I don't wish to harm you." Chaska laughed without humor. "Worry about yourself, white man." The circle of warriors opened to create a fighting space. Bear removed his gun belt, handing it to Najoni. Their eyes met briefly, hers worried, his calm. Then he stepped into the circle where Chaska waited, fists raised and fury burning in every line of his body. They crashed together like two storms colliding. Chaska moved like lightning given human form, all coiled muscle and controlled rage built from years of hunting, fighting, and surviving in a world that wanted his people erased. His first punch came fast and hard, aimed at Bear's jaw with enough force to end the fight before it truly began. Bear sidestepped, his mountain-bred instincts reading the attack a heartbeat before it landed. He'd fought grizzlies and outlaws and his own demons for 42 years, and every scar on his body had taught him one essential truth. Don't meet force with force. Use it. Redirect it. Make your opponent's strength work against him. Chaska's momentum carried him past Bear's shoulder. The Apache warrior recovered instantly, spinning with a sweep kick that would have taken Bear's legs out if he hadn't jumped back. The watching warriors murmured appreciation. This was going to be a real fight, not the quick domination they'd expected from either man. They circled each other, dust rising from their footwork, the setting sun painting everything in shades of copper and gold. Najoni watched with her hand pressed to her mouth, torn between hope and fear. Red Sky Walker observed with the calm detachment of someone who'd seen 1,000 such contests and knew that what mattered wasn't who won, but how they fought. Chaska feinted left and came in right, grappling Bear around the waist, trying to use his lower center of gravity to throw the bigger man. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and dust, rolling, each seeking advantage. Chaska got on top first, raining down punches that Bear blocked with his forearms, absorbing the impact, waiting for his opening. It came when Chaska drew back for a heavier blow. Bear bridged his hips in a wrestling move he'd learned from a Tennessee mountain man when he was 16, throwing Chaska off balance. They reversed positions, Bear now mounted, but instead of following through with violence, he did something that shocked everyone watching. He extended his hand. "You've proven your courage, brother," Bear said in Apache, breathing hard. "And I've proven I can fight. But we don't need to hurt each other to show strength. We need each other to fight the real enemy." Chaska stared at the offered hand, chest heaving, blood trickling from a split lip. Around them, the watching warriors had gone absolutely silent. This was not how such challenges ended. This was not how white men behaved. White men conquered. White men dominated. White men took and took until nothing remained. But this white man was offering respect, offering partnership, offering an end to unnecessary violence. Chaska's hand shot out and gripped Bear's forearm in the warrior's clasp. "You fight with honor and mercy, rare in any man." He allowed Bear to pull him to his feet. "You have my respect." The gathered warriors erupted in approval, not the wild cheering of bloodlust satisfied, but the deeper sound of honor recognized and acknowledged. Red Skywalker nodded slowly, his weathered face showing satisfaction. "The mountain has shown strength without cruelty," the medicine man said. "He may stay 3 days. We will decide then what comes next." Najoni rushed forward as the crowd dispersed, checking both men for serious injury. She found cuts and bruises, but nothing broken, nothing that her mother's medicine couldn't mend. As she worked, cleaning blood from Chaska's face and rebandaging the bullet wound in Bear's shoulder, the two men regarded each other with new understanding. "You hit hard for an old man," Chaska said, wincing as Najoni's herbs stung his split lip. "I'm 42, not 82. In Apache years, that's ancient. In mountain years, I'm just getting started." Najoni rolled her eyes. "Men, you beat each other half to death and now you're friends." "Not friends," Chaska corrected with a slight smile, "but allies. There's a difference." He looked at Bear seriously. "Najoni told me what Thorn did. For 2 years we knew she suffered, but we had no way to free her without starting a war that would destroy what's left of our people. You did what we couldn't. For that, you have my gratitude." "Don't need gratitude," Bear said. "Just need to finish what we started. Thorn and his brother can't keep hurting people." That evening, as stars emerged in the darkening sky, Red Skywalker summoned Bear and Najoni to his wickiup. The interior was warm from a small fire, fragrant with sage and sweetgrass, decorated with medicine bundles and sacred objects that spoke of traditions older than any white man's claim to this land. The medicine man studied Bear with eyes that seemed to see through time itself. "You carry great pain, Caleb Hutchins, the death of loved ones. Guilt that eats at your spirit like wolves eating a wounded deer, anger that burns cold and deep." Bear didn't flinch from the assessment. "Yes. But you also carry fire, not the fire of hate, the fire of justice. That fire led you to Najoni when others would have walked past her suffering." Red Skywalker turned to Najoni. "And you, daughter of Moondancer, you have learned that survival is not the same as living. This man has shown you the difference." Najoni blushed, but held the old man's gaze. "He has given me something I thought I'd lost forever, grandfather. Hope." Red Skywalker nodded as if this confirmed something he'd already known. "Now we must speak of practical matters. The ledger you carry contains evidence of crimes, but taking it to Santa Fe is dangerous. Marshal Jonas Thorn will hunt you every mile of that 200-mile journey." "We know," Bear said, "but it's the only way to bring real justice. Local law is corrupted. We need federal authorities." "How many warriors can you spare for escort?" Najoni asked. 5, including Chaska. But even 5 Apache warriors cannot stand against Marshal Jonas and his posse." Red Skywalker leaned forward. "You need a better plan." They spent the next 2 hours crafting strategy. It wasn't elaborate because the best plans never were, but it was solid, built on the strengths each person brought to the fight. They would travel through Mogollon Rim country, using the treacherous mountain terrain to slow pursuers. They would move fast, travel light, and trust in the Apache warriors' knowledge of land that had been their home for generations before white men came with maps and claims. But there was one element they couldn't plan for: Jonas Thorn's reach and his willingness to use any tool, any ally, any method to protect his corrupt empire. Over the next 3 days, Bear lived among the White Mountain Apache, learning their ways, earning their trust, one small gesture at a time. He helped repair wickiups damaged by summer storms. He shared his knowledge of mountain hunting techniques. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words carried weight because they were chosen carefully and delivered with respect. The Apache children, who'd been taught to fear white men, gradually approached this strange Biligayana, who spoke some of their language and moved through their camp without arrogance. He carved small animals from wood for them, showed them how to read weather signs in the clouds, and treated them with the same gentle attention he'd once given his daughter Emily. Najoni watched this transformation with emotions she couldn't fully name. This hard man, this scarred warrior who'd killed outlaws and wrestled bears, became soft in the presence of children. The contrast revealed depths in him she was only beginning to understand. On the second evening, she found him sitting alone near the stream that ran through the valley, watching the water flow over smooth stones worn round by centuries of current. She sat beside him without speaking, content to share the silence, until he finally broke it. "I keep thinking about Sarah and Emily," he said quietly, "wondering if I'm betraying their memory by feeling what I'm starting to feel for you." Najoni took his hand. "Tell me what you think they would say, if they could speak to you now." Bear was silent for a long moment, wrestling with ghosts. "Sarah would tell me to stop being a stubborn fool. She'd say 5 years of grief is enough, and that love doesn't replace love, it adds to it. Emily would probably ask why I took so long to figure that out. Smart women, both of them. The smartest." Bear turned to face her. "Najoni, I don't know what happens after we reach Santa Fe. Don't know if we'll survive the journey, or if justice will actually be served. But I know that since I met you, I've felt something I thought was dead. Not just attraction, purpose. The feeling that maybe I have a future worth building instead of just a past worth running from." "I feel it too," Najoni admitted, "but I'm scared. Scared to want something good because everything good in my life has been taken away." "Then we'll be scared together." Bear pulled her closer. "And maybe together we'll be brave enough to try anyway." They sat by the stream as darkness deepened and stars emerged like scattered diamonds on black velvet. Somewhere in the camp, someone was singing an old song about warriors returning home. The melody was haunting and beautiful, full of longing and hope intertwined. On the third day, as Red Skywalker had decreed, the council met to decide Bear's fate and the tribe's involvement in the coming fight. The gathering took place in the ceremonial circle, with all the warriors and elders present. Chaska spoke first, advocating for full tribal support. Others were more cautious, pointing out that helping fugitives from white man's law could bring retribution down on all their people. The debate went back and forth for hours, voices rising and falling like waves against a shore. Bear sat silent throughout, knowing this was not his place to speak, unless asked. When Red Skywalker finally turned to him and posed the question directly, Bear chose his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield. "I ask nothing that will endanger your people," he said. "The fight with Thorn is mine and Najoni's. But if warriors choose to ride with us, I promise to honor their courage and trust their judgment. I'm a guest here, I know that, and I'll respect whatever decision you make." Red Skywalker studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "5 warriors will accompany you. Chaska will lead them. You leave at dawn. May the spirits guide your path and bring you home safely." That night the tribe held a ceremony to bless the journey. Fire and sage smoke and ancient words spoken in a language that predated this nation by thousands of years. Bear felt the weight of history pressing down on him, the sense that he was part of something larger than himself, larger than his grief or his quest for justice. Najoni danced with the other women, her movements graceful and powerful, telling stories with her body that needed no translation. Bear watched her with an ache in his chest that was half pain and half something else, something that might have been hope if he'd dared to name it. Later, after most of the camp had settled for the night, Bear and Najoni walked to the edge of the firelight, where darkness and illumination mixed into something neither and both. "Are you ready?" she asked. "As ready as I'll ever be." Bear looked up at the same stars that had watched over Sarah and Emily's grave, the same stars that would watch over whatever came next. 200 miles. Rough country. Men with guns hunting us. Not exactly favorable odds. We've survived worse in the last 3 days. True. Bear turned to her. "Najoni, about what I said. About the cabin in Carolina. I meant it. When this is done, if we're both still breathing, the offer stands. No pressure. Just possibility." "Ask me again when we reach Santa Fe," she said, echoing her earlier words. "Ask me when we've won." "You think we'll win?" "I think we have to. Because if we don't, nothing changes. Thorn keeps hurting people. Jonas keeps perverting justice. And evil wins because good people were too afraid to fight." Bear smiled at her fierce certainty. "You know what I love about you? You're scared, but you do it anyway. That's real courage." Najoni's eyes widened slightly. "What you love about me?" Bear realized what he'd said. He could have backtracked, softened it, pretended it was just a figure of speech. Instead, he doubled down on truth. "Yeah, what I love about you. Because somewhere between Copper Ridge and here, between gunfights and horse chases and sitting by streams talking about dead people and possible futures, I fell in love with you. Didn't plan it, didn't see it coming. But there it is." Tears gleamed in Najoni's eyes, reflecting firelight. "You impossible, stubborn, scarred mountain man. I love you too. Even though I shouldn't. Even though it's too fast and too dangerous and probably doomed." "Probably," Bear agreed. "But I'll take probably doomed over definitely alone." They kissed then, properly this time, not the quick brush of lips from before, but a real kiss that tasted of smoke and hope and desperate futures. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard and smiling despite the danger that waited beyond the dawn. "We should sleep," Najoni said practically. "Long ride tomorrow." "We should," Bear agreed, but neither moved. They stood there in the space between light and dark, holding each other as the fire burned down and the stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, they had this: warmth and connection, and the fragile beginning of something that might, with luck and courage, survive the coming storm. As they finally turned back toward the camp, Chaska emerged from the shadows, startling them both. "Sorry to interrupt," he said with a knowing smile, "but I wanted to tell you, Bear. If you hurt her, I'll track you to the ends of the earth and feed you to the buzzards piece by piece." "Fair enough," Bear said. "And if I let anyone hurt her, you won't need to track me because I'll have already fed myself to them." Chaska laughed, a real laugh full of genuine warmth. "Good answer. Now get some sleep. Dawn comes early and we have a long road ahead." He was right. The road ahead was long and dangerous, fraught with enemies and uncertainty. But as Bear lay down that night in the wickiup the tribe had provided, with Najoni sleeping peacefully nearby, and the knowledge that tomorrow he'd ride with Apache warriors toward something that mattered, he felt more alive than he had in 5 years. The mountain was learning to trust again. The wind had found a place to rest. And somewhere in the darkness, justice was gathering its forces for a reckoning that would echo through Arizona territory for years to come. But first, they had to survive the journey. First, they had to outrun or outfight Marshal Jonas Thorn and every gun he could muster. First, they had to prove that sometimes, against all odds and common sense, the good guys actually won. At dawn, 5 warriors assembled: Chaska, Kale the archer, Dakota the tracker, and 2 others whose names meant Braveheart and Swift Runner. They were young, strong, and ready to fight for justice and for one of their own who'd suffered too long in silence. Bear checked his weapons, his supplies, his horse. Najoni did the same with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned that survival depended on preparation. They mounted as the sun broke over the eastern mountains, painting the world in shades of promise and warning. Red Skywalker raised his hand in blessing. Go with the spirits, return with honor, and remember, the mountain is strong because it does not bend. The wind is free because it does not stay. Together, you are both. They rode out as the camp watched, heading west toward Mogollon Rim, and beyond it, Santa Fe and the hope of justice finally served. Behind them, the White Mountain Apache returned to their lives, but something had changed. A white man had come to their camp, earned their respect, and ridden out with their blessing and their warriors at his side. It wasn't much in this grand scheme of things. It wouldn't heal centuries of broken treaties and stolen land. But it was a beginning, a small bridge built between worlds that had been at war too long. And sometimes, Bear thought, as they climbed into the high country where pine trees grew thick and the air smelled of resin and possibility, sometimes small beginnings were enough. Sometimes they were everything. The Mogollon Rim rose before them like a fortress built by gods with too much time and stone to spare. 2,000 feet of sheer cliff face separating the high plateau from the desert below, carved by millions of years of wind and water into something simultaneously beautiful and terrifying. Bear Hutchins had seen mountains all his life, had grown up in the Appalachians where peaks touched clouds and valleys hid secrets. But this was different. This was the Southwest in all its harsh majesty, unforgiving and honest about what it demanded from those who dared cross it. They were 5 now, riding in loose formation through ponderosa pine forests that smelled of vanilla and resin. Bear took point with Chaska, while Najoni rode protected in the middle with Kaylee and Dakota flanking her, and the other 2 warriors covering their back trail. It was good strategy, professional even, but Bear knew that all the strategy in the world meant nothing if Marshal Jonas Thorne had sent riders ahead to cut them off. The first day passed without incident, which made Bear more nervous rather than less. In his experience, quiet usually meant trouble was gathering itself for a louder entrance. They made camp that evening in a box canyon with only one entrance that Dakota could watch while the others slept. No fire, cold food, whispered conversations, if any at all. Bear sat with his back against sun-warmed stone, cleaning his rifle with the automatic movements of 40 years' habit, while Chaska did the same with his Winchester. The young Apache warrior had proven himself observant and tactical, asking questions about Bear's tracking methods and sharing his own knowledge of reading sign in ways Bear had never considered. "You move quiet for a big man," Chaska observed, running an oiled cloth along his rifle barrel. "Learned from necessity. Loud men don't survive long in bear country." "Is that really how you got the name? From a bear?" Bear pulled aside his collar to show the scars that ran from his collarbone down across his chest, 4 parallel lines where claws had tried to open him like a letter. "Grizzly sow protecting cubs. I was 16, stupid, and didn't see her until too late. She hit me like a freight train made of teeth and anger." "How did you survive?" "My pa shot her. Then he spent 3 weeks keeping me alive while the wounds festered and fever tried to finish what the bear started." Bear smiled at the memory despite the pain it carried. "When I finally could talk again, first thing I said was, 'Did you have to kill her?' Pa just shook his head and said, 'Boy, you got a good heart, but a foolish head.' Been trying to balance those 2 ever since." Chaska laughed quietly. "My father said something similar about me. Chaska, your courage will either make you chief or get you killed. Try to choose wisely." "Did you choose wisely coming on this ride?" The Apache warrior looked toward where Najoni was helping Kale prepare dried meat for their evening meal. "She's like a sister to me. We grew up together, learned to ride together, got in trouble together. When Thorne took her, part of our tribe's soul went with her. So yes, I chose wisely. Even if we die trying to free one of our own." Bear understood that sentiment down to his bones. Loyalty and love were the only things worth dying for, because they were the only things that made life worth living in the first place. Najoni approached carrying food, settling beside Bear with the easy intimacy of someone who'd decided that propriety mattered less than connection. She handed him jerky and hardtack, then produced a small pouch of dried berries that she'd gathered during one of their brief stops. "Thought you might want something that doesn't taste like old leather," she said. Bear took the berries gratefully. "You're spoiling me." "Someone should. You've spent 5 years not taking care of yourself." Chaska stood, stretching. "I'll check the perimeter. You two try not to be too obvious." He walked away grinning, leaving them alone as the sun painted the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose. Najoni leaned against Bear's shoulder. "Are you scared?" "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of dying. I made peace with that possibility years ago. Scared of failing. Scared Jonas will catch us before we reach Santa Fe. Scared this ledger won't be enough. Scared that even if we win, it won't matter." "It'll matter," Najoni said with fierce certainty. "Even if we only save one person from what Thorn did to me, it matters. Even if we only prove that someone cared enough to fight, it matters." Bear kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of sage and smoke that clung to her hair. "When did you get so wise?" "Suffering teaches. I had a good teacher in pain." She looked up at him. "But you're teaching me something better. You're teaching me hope." They sat together as darkness fell, and stars emerged in that violent profusion that only happened in places untouched by city lights. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of diamonds, and Bear remembered sitting with Emily on their porch in Tennessee, teaching her the constellations, while Sarah hummed folk songs from her Kentucky childhood. The memory didn't hurt as much as it used to. It was still there, still tender, but now it lived alongside new possibilities instead of drowning them. Maybe that was what healing meant. Not forgetting, just making room for what came next. They slept in shifts that night, and when Bear woke for the dawn watch, he found Dakota already awake, staring at the eastern horizon with the intensity of someone reading a language written in light and shadow. "Riders," the tracker said quietly. 8 men, maybe 10, coming from the west, pushing hard. Bear's gut clenched. "How far?" "Half day behind us. But they know where we're going. They're not tracking. They're intercepting." "Jonas sent word ahead," Bear said, cursing under his breath. "He's got men positioned between us and Santa Fe." "So we go around." Dakota traced an invisible line in the air. "Through the rim country. Harder terrain. Slower. But they won't expect it." They broke camp immediately, riding north along the rim instead of west toward their destination. The change in direction added days to their journey, but staying alive mattered more than speed. They climbed through pine forests where the air grew thin and cold, where elk watched them pass with liquid brown eyes, where the silence was so complete that their horses' hoofbeats seemed like drum announcements of their presence. By midday, they reached a narrow pass where the trail squeezed between massive boulders, barely wide enough for a horse and rider. Chaska, riding point, suddenly raised his fist in the signal for stop. Everyone froze. Ahead, blocking the pass, sat 8 men on horseback. And leading them was a face Bear recognized from wanted posters and Sam Brennan's descriptions. Rattlesnake Jack Donovan himself, 40 years of violence and greed packed into a lean frame with eyes like chips of flint. "Well now," Jack drawled, his voice carrying the flat accent of Texas mixed with years of living rough. "Caleb Hutchins, I was hoping we'd meet proper-like instead of you shooting at me from ambush back in that meadow." Bear's hand moved toward his rifle, but the odds were bad. 8 against 5, and Jack's men had them boxed in with high ground on both sides. "Jack, still running errands for corrupt lawmen instead of working honest?" "Honest don't pay nearly as well." Jack spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Marshal Jonas wants that ledger you're carrying. Hand it over and we'll let the girl go." You and your Apache friends can ride back to whatever hole you crawled from." "That's a lie," Bear said calmly. "Jonas won't let any of us live. We know too much." Jack shrugged. "Probably right. But I figured I'd offer anyway, being a gentleman and all." Najoni's hand moved to her revolver. Chaska had an arrow nocked. Kale and Dakota were positioning for a fight. This was going to get bloody, and Bear knew that in a straight gunfight from this position, they'd lose at least half their people. Then a rifle shot cracked from the rocks above Jack's position. One of the outlaws jerked and fell from his saddle. Another shot, another man down. Jack's posse scattered, seeking cover, confusion breaking their formation. Bear didn't hesitate. "Ride, now, through the pass." They spurred their horses forward, threading through the chaos as more shots came from above. Someone was providing covering fire, but Bear didn't have time to wonder who. They crashed through the pass, bullets whining off stone around them, and emerged on the other side at full gallop. Behind them, the firefight continued for another minute, then faded as distance swallowed the sound. They rode hard for an hour before daring to slow down and assess damage. Miraculously, none of them were hit, though Kaylee's horse had taken a graze across the flank that made it limp. "Who was shooting from above?" Najoni asked, breathing hard. "Don't know," Bear said, "but they saved our lives." Chaska looked troubled. "Maybe. Or maybe they just wanted us to keep running in a specific direction." Bear was about to respond when movement caught his eye. Two figures emerged from the rocks above the pass, leading horses down the steep trail with the sure-footedness of men born to mountains. Braveheart and Swift Runner, the two warriors who'd ridden out with them from the White Mountain Reservation. "We wondered when you'd notice us," Braveheart called down, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. Chaska's troubled expression transformed into a grin. "I sent them ahead this morning to scout the trail. Didn't think they'd have to save your hides quite so dramatically." "We saw Rattlesnake Jack's men setting up the ambush yesterday," Swift Runner explained as they reached level ground. "Tracked them through the night. Figured you'd come through that pass eventually." "You could have warned us," Najoni said, though her smile showed she wasn't truly angry. "And missed the chance to prove we're better shots?" Braveheart's grin was infectious. "Where's the fun in that?" Bear shook his head, but he was smiling too. "Remind me never to play cards with you people. You're all too damn clever." "That's how we've survived this long," Chaska said, suddenly serious. "By being 3 steps ahead of men who think we're 2 steps behind." It was a valid concern. In Bear's experience, mysterious help usually came with strings attached, but they had no choice except to keep moving and stay alert. They made camp that evening in an abandoned army fort from the Apache Wars, its adobe walls crumbling but still providing some shelter and defensive advantage. While the warriors tended horses and set a watch rotation, Bear studied the map Sam Brennan had given him before they fled Copper Ridge. "We're here," he said, pointing to a spot on the Mogollon Rim. "Santa Fe is here. That's still 150 miles, and Jonas knows we're coming." Najoni knelt beside him, studying the map. "What if we split up? Send decoys in one direction while the real group goes another?" "That puts people at risk for a diversion." "Everything we're doing puts people at risk." She met his eyes. "But if 2 riders with the ledger could reach Santa Fe while 3 others drew pursuers in a different direction." Chaska joined them. "She's right. Basic Apache tactics. Make the enemy chase shadows while the real strike happens elsewhere." Bear hated the idea of splitting up, hated the thought of Najoni being exposed to more danger, but tactically it made sense. "Who takes the ledger?" "You and I," Chaska said. "You know Santa Fe. I can navigate terrain. We're the logical choice." "No," Najoni said firmly. "I go. That ledger represents 2 years of my life. I carry it to the end." The 3 of them stared at each other, each seeing the logic in their own position and the danger in any choice. Finally Bear spoke. "Najoni and I take the ledger. We're the ones Jonas wants dead anyway. Chaska, you take Kayle and Dakota, create a false trail heading northwest toward Flagstaff. Make noise. Make it obvious. Give us 3 days head start." "And if Jonas catches us?" Don't get caught." Bear gripped the younger man's shoulder. "I'm trusting you with something precious. Keep your people alive. We'll meet in Santa Fe when this is done." Chaska nodded slowly. 3 days. Then we disappear like smoke. That night, their last together as a group, they shared stories around a small fire they risked despite the danger. Dakota told of hunting his first elk. Cale spoke of the woman he hoped to marry when they returned. Chaska talked about his father, killed in battle against cavalry, and his determination to honor that memory through courage rather than hatred. When it was Bear's turn, he talked about Sarah teaching Emily to read, about the joy of watching his daughter discover that words on a page could create entire worlds. His voice caught only once, and Najoni's hand found his in the darkness, steadying him. "They'd be proud of you," she whispered after he finished, "for not giving up on living." "I had good motivation," Bear replied, squeezing her hand. Later, when the others had bedded down, and only the watch remained awake, Bear and Najoni walked to the fort's crumbling wall, looking out over darkened valleys stretching toward invisible horizons. "I'm scared," Najoni admitted. "More scared than I was in Thorne's store. Because now I have something to lose. Before, I had nothing, just survival. But now I have you, and hope, and the possibility of a future. Losing that would hurt worse than any beating." Bear turned her to face him, his scarred hands gentle on her shoulders. "Then we don't lose. We fight smart, we stay alive, and we build that future, together." "You make it sound simple." "It is simple. Not easy, but simple." Bear touched her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. "Najoni, when this is over, when the dust settles and Jonas is behind bars and Thorne is nothing but a bad memory, I'm going to ask you to marry me. Proper-like, with witnesses and ceremony and all the things that make it official. I'm telling you now so you have time to think about your answer." Tears gleamed in her eyes. "That's not fair. You can't propose and tell me to wait to answer." "Why not?" "Because I want to say yes right now, and you're making me be patient." Bear laughed, surprised and delighted. "So that's a preliminary yes?" "That's a definite yes, you impossible man. Yes when we get to Santa Fe. Yes when this is over. Yes to Carolina and your cabin and whatever life we can build together." She kissed him hard, tasting of salt and smoke and promises. "But you have to survive to make it official." "Deal." They stood together on that crumbling wall, two people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and somehow forged something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate pasts. The night wind whispered through the ruins, carrying the scent of pine and possibility. At dawn, they split up. Chaska's group rode northwest, making no effort to hide their trail, leaving clear signs for any tracker to follow. Bear and Najoni went northeast, moving carefully, using every trick Bear knew to hide their passage. For 3 days they traveled alone through country that grew increasingly rugged and remote. They saw no other humans, only elk and eagles, and once, in the distance, a wolf pack moving like gray ghosts through morning mist. The solitude was both blessing and curse, safer from immediate discovery, but more vulnerable if they encountered trouble with no backup to call upon. On the 4th day, they descended from the high country toward the valley where Santa Fe spread its adobe buildings across the landscape like scattered clay blocks. From their vantage point, the territorial capital looked peaceful, civilized, a place where laws still meant something, and justice could be found if you knew where to look. "Almost there," Najoni breathed. "Almost," Bear agreed, but his instincts were screaming warnings his conscious mind couldn't quite articulate. Something felt wrong, too easy. Jonas wouldn't simply let them waltz into Santa Fe unchallenged. They were a mile from town when riders emerged from a stand of cottonwoods ahead. Not Jonas's men. These wore federal marshal badges that gleamed silver in the afternoon sun. But leading them was Marshal Jonas Thorne himself, and his smile was the smile of a man who'd won a game his opponent didn't know they were playing. "Hutchins!" Jonas called out, his voice carrying across the distance. "I was wondering when you'd arrive. Been waiting 3 days." He held up a piece of paper. "I have a warrant here for your arrest. Murder of 3 law-abiding citizens in Copper Ridge. Kidnapping of an Indian ward. Theft of property. Shall I go on?" Bear's heart sank. Jonas had gotten ahead of them, poisoned the well, made them criminals before they could present their evidence. It was brilliant and ruthless, and exactly what he should have expected from a man who'd built an empire on corruption. "That ledger you're carrying," Jonas continued, "won't matter. Already spoken to Judge Blackwood. Explained how you stole it after murdering my brother's clerk. How you've been using that poor Apache girl for your own purposes. The judge is very concerned about bringing you to justice." Najoni's hand moved toward her gun, but Bear caught her wrist. "Don't. We're outnumbered and outmaneuvered. So we surrender? So we trust that truth is stronger than lies?" Bear raised his voice. "Marshal Thorne, we're coming in peacefully, but we demand to see Judge Blackwood immediately. We have evidence of corruption that reaches all the way to you and your brother." Jonas laughed. "Oh, you'll see the judge, right before he sentences you to hang." They rode forward slowly, hands visible, making no threatening moves. As federal marshals surrounded them and took their weapons, Bear met Najoni's frightened eyes and tried to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Trust me," he mouthed. She nodded, but her face was pale. They were escorted into Santa Fe like criminals, hands bound, their horses led by deputies who wouldn't meet their eyes. Townspeople watched from doorways and windows, curious about the spectacle of a mountain man and an Apache girl being brought to justice. Only Bear knew that the real test was just beginning. Jonas had won the first battle, but the war wasn't over, not by a long shot. The Santa Fe jail smelled of unwashed bodies, despair, and the particular kind of hopelessness that came from knowing the system designed to protect you had been twisted into a weapon aimed at your heart. Bear sat on a wooden bench in a cell barely large enough for 2 people, his wrists raw from the rope that had bound them during the ride into town, watching dust motes drift through the single barred window like tiny prayers that would never be answered. Najoni occupied the cell beside his, separated by iron bars and Marshal Jonas Thorne's smug certainty that he'd won. She sat with her back straight despite everything, her dignity unbroken even in captivity, and Bear had never loved her more than in that moment when she refused to let defeat touch her spirit. "We're going to die here," she said quietly. Not a question, just the calm assessment of someone who'd learned to recognize inevitability when it sat down across from her. "Maybe," Bear admitted, "but not without a fight, and not without Jonas paying for what he's done." A deputy brought them water and stale bread, setting the tin plates through a slot in the bars with the mechanical disinterest of someone who'd stopped seeing prisoners as people years ago. Bear waited until the man left before speaking again. "That ledger, did they take it?" "Yes, Jonas has it now." Najoni's voice carried frustration and fury in equal measure. 2 years of evidence, names, dates, amounts, everything needed to convict both Thorne brothers, and now it's in his hands. Then we tell the judge. We testify to what we saw. You think he'll listen? Jonas said he'd already spoken to Blackwood. What if the corruption runs deeper than we thought? Bear had considered that possibility, had wrestled with it during the silent ride to jail, but giving up wasn't in his nature, and he'd be damned if he'd let Najoni's courage be for nothing. Then we make him listen. We tell the truth so loud and clear that everyone in that courtroom hears it, judge included. Sometimes all it takes is one person refusing to be silent to wake up everybody else. The night passed with agonizing slowness, measured in the creaking of the jail's timbers and the distant sounds of Santa Fe settling into sleep. Bear dozed fitfully, his mind churning through possibilities and plans, most of which ended with him and Najoni hanging from a rope while Jonas Thorne watched with satisfaction. But just before dawn, when the darkness was at its deepest and hope its faintest, footsteps echoed in the jail's hallway. Not the heavy tread of deputies making rounds. Something lighter, more purposeful. Bear was instantly alert, his hand moving instinctively toward a weapon that wasn't there. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Bear's heart nearly stopped. Grace Hartwell, the boarding house owner from Copper Ridge, stood in the corridor holding a key ring that clinked softly with her movements. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut, but her expression carried the fierce determination of someone who'd finally decided that survival meant less than doing right. "Grace," Bear breathed, "what are you doing here?" "Fixing my mistake." She unlocked his cell, then Najoni's, her hands shaking but steady enough. "Jonas came to Copper Ridge after you left. Beat the information out of me about your plans. I'm so sorry. I tried to hold out, but he threatened to burn down my boarding house with everyone inside." "It's not your fault," Najoni said, touching the older woman's arm gently. "You did what you had to do." "No, I betrayed you, but I can make it right." Grace pressed a package into Bear's hands. "The ledger. I stole it from Jonas's hotel room an hour ago, and I have something else, something better." She produced a second book, smaller but no less damning. "This is Jonas's personal journal. I found it hidden in his saddlebag. 3 years of notes about bribes paid, threats made, people killed, everything you need to prove his corruption to Judge Blackwood." Bear stared at the 2 books, feeling the weight of justice in his palms. "Grace, this is incredibly dangerous. If Jonas finds out you helped us, then he finds out. I'm done being afraid." She straightened her shoulders. "Sam Brennan sent a telegram 2 days ago. Said to tell you that Copper Ridge is rising. The townspeople have had enough. They've freed Sam from jail, armed themselves, and surrounded Ezekiel's store. They're waiting for proof from Santa Fe that the law actually works before they take matters into their own hands." Najoni's eyes widened. "The people are fighting back?" "All it took was one old man refusing to quit, and one mountain man showing them that courage was possible." Grace smiled through split lips. "Now go. Judge Blackwood holds court at 8 this morning. You have 2 hours to prepare your case." They slipped out of the jail through a back door Grace had unlocked earlier, moving through Santa Fe's pre-dawn streets like ghosts afraid of sunrise. The territorial capital was just beginning to wake, smoke rising from chimneys, shopkeepers opening shutters, a world going about its business, unaware that justice and corruption were about to collide in its courthouse. Judge Nathaniel Blackwood's residence sat on a quiet street lined with cottonwood trees, a modest adobe house that spoke of a man who valued substance over appearance. Bear knocked firmly but not aggressively, aware that waking a territorial judge before dawn could go very wrong if handled poorly. The man who opened the door was 65, with silver hair and eyes that had seen enough human nature to be neither surprised nor easily fooled. He wore a nightshirt and suspicion in equal measure. "Caleb Hutchins," he said, recognizing Bear from descriptions Jonas had undoubtedly provided. "You're supposed to be in jail awaiting arraignment for murder." "I was, but I have evidence that changes everything." Bear held up both books. "May we come in? What we have to say could save lives or end them, depending on what you decide in the next hour." Blackwood studied them for a long moment, then stepped aside. "This better be worth waking me before coffee." They sat in his study while he lit lamps and boiled water, taking their time to do this right because rushing would only undermine their credibility. When the judge finally settled behind his desk with a steaming cup, Bear began. Bear laid out the evidence with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent decades tracking truth through lies. He started with the ledger, flipping through pages filled with Ezekiel Thorne's meticulous record-keeping, dates of gun sales to known outlaws, bribes paid to local officials, falsified invoices submitted to the Army for supplies never delivered. Then he produced Jonas's journal, and Judge Blackwood's expression shifted from professional interest to barely concealed fury as Bear read entry after damning entry. The corruption ran deeper than a mine shaft, and Jonas Thorne had documented every foot of it in his own hand, perhaps never imagining his private records would become the noose around his neck. Blackwood listened without interruption, his face revealing nothing. When Bear finished, the judge opened Jonas's journal and began reading. Minutes passed, then 10 minutes, then 20. The only sound was pages turning and the judge's occasional grunt of recognition or disgust. Finally, Blackwood closed the journal and looked at them both. If half of what's written here is true, Jonas Thorne is the most corrupt law officer in territorial history, and his brother Ezekiel is running an operation that makes the worst robber barons look charitable. "It's all true," Najoni said quietly. "I lived it for 2 years. I saw the ledgers. I heard the conversations. I was property to them, merchandise they could use and discard." The judge's jaw tightened. "I'll need time to verify some of this. Send telegrams to federal authorities, but I can promise you this. Jonas Thorne will answer for his crimes in my court. Today." At 8 o'clock that morning, the Santa Fe courthouse filled with spectators drawn by rumors of a sensational case. Marshal Jonas Thorne sat at the prosecutor's table, confident and composed, clearly expecting a quick conviction followed by a hanging that would tie up all loose ends permanently. His deputies flanked the doors, armed and alert. Then Judge Blackwood entered, and something in his expression made Jonas's confidence falter. The judge's eyes were cold, his bearing that of a man who'd discovered betrayal in his own house and intended to cleanse it with fire. "This court is now in session." Blackwood's voice carried authority earned through decades on the bench. "Marshal Thorne, you are here to prosecute Caleb Hutchins and Najoni of the White Mountain Apache for various crimes. But before we proceed, I have questions for you under oath." Jonas stood, confusion flickering across his features. "Your Honor, I'm the prosecutor, not a witness." "You're whatever I say you are in my courtroom. Take the stand." The crowd murmured. Jonas's deputies shifted nervously. Something was wrong, and everyone could feel it. Jonas climbed into the witness box with the wariness of a man walking into a trap he couldn't see. Blackwood administered the oath, then produced the journal. "Is this your handwriting, Marshal?" Jonas's face went pale. "Where did you get that?" "Answer the question. Is this your handwriting?" A long pause. Then, barely audible, "Yes." "Then explain this entry from April 1882. Blackwood read aloud. "Paid Sheriff Polk $300 to ignore Ezekiel's treatment of the Apache girl. She knows too much, but keeping her scared keeps her silent. If she ever talks, we'll make it look like she attacked first." The courtroom erupted. Jonas tried to speak, but Blackwood cut him off. "Or this one from June 1883. Sold 20 Winchester rifles to Rattlesnake Jack. Ezekiel provides the weapons from his store inventory reported as stolen. I provide federal protection. We split the profits. Jack gets to keep operating, and everyone wins except the fools who think law means something." Jonas stood, knocking his chair backward. "That journal is fabricated. A forgery designed to frame me." "Is it?" Bear's voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. He walked forward, Najoni beside him, both moving with the calm certainty of people who'd stopped being afraid. "Then explain the dates that match receipts in Ezekiel's ledger. Explain the names of men you claim to have arrested who actually work for you. Explain why Sam Brennan, a decorated Texas Ranger, says he spent 6 months gathering evidence of your crimes." Jonas's hand moved toward his gun, but federal marshals who'd entered quietly during the proceedings moved faster. Within seconds, Jonas Thorne was disarmed and in custody, his deputies choosing to surrender rather than fight for a lost cause. The trial that followed lasted 3 days, but the outcome was never in doubt once Judge Blackwood started reading evidence aloud. Witness after witness came forward, people who'd been too scared to speak until someone showed them courage was possible. Shop owners Ezekiel had extorted. Apache families Jonas had threatened. Even Sheriff Polk from Copper Ridge, who traveled to Santa Fe to testify about years of corruption he'd been forced to enable. Najoni took the stand on the second day, and her testimony was the most powerful of all. She spoke quietly but clearly about her 2 years of captivity, the beatings, the threats, the casual cruelty of men who saw her as less than human. She spoke about watching Ezekiel sell weapons to outlaws while his brother provided legal cover. She spoke about the moment Bear Hutchins had walked into that store and shown her that not all white men were monsters. "I don't want revenge," she said, looking directly at Jonas in his prisoner's dock. "I want justice. I want these men to face consequences so that what happened to me never happens to anyone else. That's all. Just justice." When she stepped down, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the hardened federal marshals looked moved. On the third day, Judge Blackwood delivered his verdict. "Jonas Thorne, Ezekiel Thorne, you are found guilty of corruption, gun smuggling, slavery, extortion, and conspiracy to commit murder. I sentence you both to 20 years in federal prison. You are stripped of all authority, all property, and all rights to appeal based on technicalities. The evidence against you is overwhelming and damning." He turned to Bear and Najoni. "As for you two, all charges are dismissed with prejudice. Moreover, I'm authorizing compensation for Miss Najoni in the amount of $5,000 for her suffering and illegal detention. The funds will come from the seized assets of both Thorne brothers." Najoni gasped. $5,000 was a fortune, enough to build a life, enough to have choices she'd never dreamed possible. But Blackwood wasn't finished. "The White Mountain Apache will also receive restoration of lands illegally taken through Ezekiel Thorne's fraudulent dealings. And this court formally apologizes to Miss Najoni and her people for the failure of justice that allowed this situation to persist." The courtroom erupted in applause. Jonas and Ezekiel were led away in chains, their empire crumbling around them, their corruption finally exposed to light that burned away shadows. Bear found Najoni in the chaos, pulling her into his arms while she cried tears that were equal parts relief, joy, and the release of 2 years of bottled pain. Grace Hartwell fought through the crowd to reach them, her bruised face transformed by a smile that made her look 20 years younger. Sam sent another telegram. "Copper Ridge is celebrating. They're talking about electing him mayor." Bear laughed at the image of Sam Brennan, grizzled and ornery, trying to run a town. "He'll hate every minute of it." "Probably, but he'll do it anyway because that's who he is." Grace hugged them both. "You did it. You actually did it." Outside the courthouse, they found Chaska waiting with Cale and Dakota, all three looking trail-worn but unharmed. They'd evaded Jonas's men and made their way to Santa Fe just in time to watch justice prevail. "My sister," Chaska said, embracing Najoni, "you were magnificent in there. Father would be proud." "We all should be proud," Bear said. "This wasn't one person's victory. It was all of us refusing to give up." They spent that evening at the best restaurant in Santa Fe, a celebration dinner where stories were told and futures discussed. Chaska spoke of returning to his people with news of restored lands. Grace talked about expanding her boarding house. Sam, who arrived by stagecoach that afternoon, grumbled about politics but couldn't hide his satisfaction at seeing justice done. And Bear and Najoni sat close together, hands intertwined under the table, speaking little but saying everything through the language of two souls that had found each other in darkness and chosen to walk toward light together. Later, as stars emerged above Santa Fe and the celebration wound down, Bear led Najoni to a quiet courtyard behind their hotel. They sat on a stone bench while a fountain played music in the background, and for the first time in weeks, the future felt like something they could actually plan for instead of just survive toward. "So," Bear said, "about that proposal." Najoni laughed. "You're really going to ask now? After everything?" "Can't think of a better time. We're alive. We won. And I love you more than I thought possible to love anything after Sarah and Emily." Bear slid off the bench onto one knee, taking her hands in his. "Najoni, will you marry me? Will you come to Carolina and build a life where we can be ourselves and choose our own path? Will you trust me to honor you and protect you and love you for as long as I'm breathing?" "Yes," she said, pulling him up to kiss him properly. "Yes to all of it. To Carolina and cabin and whatever comes next. Yes to choosing each other every day. Yes to everything. They held each other as the fountain sang and the stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the distance, the future waited with open arms and endless possibilities. The mountain and the wind had found each other, and together they would build something neither could have imagined alone. Something like home, something like peace, something like forever. The Arizona sun rose over Santa Fe like liquid gold poured across adobe buildings and dusty streets, painting everything in shades of promise. Bear Hutchins stood on the hotel balcony, watching the territorial capital wake to a world where corrupt men no longer held power and justice, however delayed, had finally arrived. Behind him, Najoni moved about their room, preparing for the day that would change everything once more. 3 weeks had passed since Judge Blackwood's verdict sent the Thorne brothers to federal prison. 3 weeks of learning to live without fear tightening their chests with every unexpected sound, without constantly calculating how many bullets remained and whether it would be enough. Peace, Bear was discovering, felt heavier than danger. It was a warm blanket that simultaneously comforted and suffocated because part of him had grown so accustomed to the fight that safety felt suspicious. "You're thinking too loud," Najoni said, joining him. She wore a new dress, simple but well made, purchased with a small portion of the $5,000 Judge Blackwood had awarded her. The bruises Ezekiel Thorne had given her were long faded, replaced by color that came from good food and better sleep, and the gradual healing that happened when a body finally believed it was safe. "Just trying to figure out what comes next." Bear pulled her close. "Spent 5 years knowing exactly what I was doing. Hunt bounties. Stay alone. Don't think about tomorrow. Now tomorrow's all I can think about." "Is that a bad thing?" "No, just different. Good different." A knock interrupted them. Chaska entered without waiting, as had become his habit. The Apache warrior had appointed himself their unofficial guardian and constant companion, a role that amused Bear and comforted Najoni equally. "Red Sky Walker has arrived," Chaska announced. "He wants to speak with you before the ceremony." The ceremony. Today they would marry twice. Once in the Apache way, with Red Sky Walker presiding and tribal traditions honored. Then again in the Christian way at the small mission church where Father Mendoza had offered to perform a blessing. 2 worlds, 2 traditions, joined together like the couple they celebrated. They found Red Sky Walker in the courtyard beneath a cottonwood tree, looking exactly as he had at the White Mountain Reservation, as if time and travel couldn't touch whatever ancient force animated his weathered frame. "Sit, children." His voice carried gentle command that made everyone from warriors to children obey. They sat. Red Sky Walker studied them with eyes that seemed to see through flesh into souls beneath. "You have been through fire, been tested by cruelty and corruption, been broken and mended. Now you stand ready to join your lives. But before I bless this union, I must know. Do you understand what you're choosing?" Bear spoke first. "I'm choosing a woman who showed me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's moving forward despite it. Who taught me that love doesn't replace love, it adds to it. Who made me remember why I wanted to keep living." Najoni's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm choosing a man who saw me as human when others saw property. Who risked everything for someone he barely knew. Who carries pain but refuses to let it define him. Who makes me believe that broken things can become beautiful if mended with care." Red Sky Walker nodded slowly. "Good. You see each other clearly, not through fog that blinds young lovers, but with eyes opened by suffering." He reached into a leather pouch and produced 2 items, a small carved bear and a feather. "Bear, this represents your strength, your ability to protect, but also your solitude, because bears walk alone until they choose not to." He handed the carving to Bear. "Keep this to remember that choosing partnership is choosing vulnerability, every day." He turned to Najoni. "This feather represents your freedom. your ability to rise above circumstances that would crush others, your refusal to be caged. He placed it in her palm. Keep this to remember that love should never be prison, even a comfortable one. They exchanged the items, trading pieces of themselves, becoming something new while honoring what they'd been. Tonight you will speak vows before your people and before spirits who watch over such things. These vows are not chains. They are choices you make freely. And tomorrow, when you wake beside each other, you will choose again. Every day is a choice. Remember that when times are hard, as they will be. The ceremony that evening was unlike anything Santa Fe had seen. The White Mountain Apache who'd traveled to witness brought drums and songs that echoed off adobe walls. They brought cornmeal and sacred herbs, created a circle of blessing under stars that had watched over their people since time forgot to count. Nizhoni wore traditional Apache dress, doeskin decorated with turquoise and silver, her long black hair unbound and flowing. Bear wore his best clothes, but at Red Skywalker's insistence, he also wore a red cloth band around his forehead, symbol that he was being adopted into the tribe through marriage. The vows they spoke were in both Apache and English, witnessed by two peoples learning to see each other as human rather than enemy. Chaska stood beside Bear as brother and friend. Grace Hartwell wept openly, her boarding house heart finding joy in this union she'd helped make possible. Sam Brennan watched with satisfaction of a man who'd lived long enough to see one thing turn out right. When Red Skywalker pronounced them married in the Apache way, bound by choice and witnessed by community, the celebration that followed lasted until dawn. There was dancing and food and stories told around fires that transformed the courtyard into something timeless, a space where past and future existed simultaneously. The Christian ceremony the next morning was quieter, more formal, but no less meaningful. Father Mendoza spoke of love as an act of faith, of marriage as partnership that required constant choosing. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the priest said, smiling. "You may kiss your bride." Bear did, thoroughly and without hurry, while the small congregation applauded and Chaska shouted something in Apache that made Nizhoni blush and laugh simultaneously. They spent 2 more weeks in Santa Fe, finalizing details and saying goodbyes to people who'd become family through shared struggle. The compensation money sat in a bank account, waiting to fund whatever future they chose. The lands restored to the White Mountain Apache were formally transferred, with ceremonies and paperwork that would have been incomprehensible to ancestors who'd never needed European concepts of ownership. On a morning when autumn had just begun touching the air with coolness, Bear and Nizhoni prepared to leave for North Carolina. They stood in the stable checking saddles when commotion outside drew their attention. A rider had arrived, pushing his horse hard enough to leave it lathered and exhausted. The man dismounted and ran for the hotel, his face urgent with news that couldn't wait. Bear's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, old habits dying hard. "Hutchins!" The rider spotted him. "Message from Copper Ridge. Sam Brennan is asking for you, says it's important." Bear's gut clenched. Sam wouldn't send unless something was seriously wrong. "What happened?" "Ezekiel Thorne escaped federal custody, killed 2 guards. He's headed back to Copper Ridge and Sam thinks he's coming for revenge." The news hit like a physical blow. Bear had thought this was over, had allowed himself to believe that justice served meant peace secured. But men like Ezekiel Thorne didn't accept defeat. They festered and plotted and waited for their moment to strike back. "When?" Bear demanded. 3 days ago. He's got maybe a day's head start, but he's alone and on foot." Nizhoni was already resaddling her horse. "We go. Now." "You don't have to. This isn't your fight anymore. Anywhere you go is my fight. That's what marriage means." She met his eyes with steel. "Besides, Grace and Sam are my friends too. If Thorne wants revenge, he'll get it. Just not the kind he's expecting." They rode out within the hour, pushing their horses as hard as they dared, eating up miles between Santa Fe and Copper Ridge with grim determination. Chaska insisted on accompanying them, bringing Cale and Dakota as backup. "You're family now. Family doesn't let family face danger alone." The journey that had taken weeks the first time took only 4 days of brutal riding. They arrived in Copper Ridge as the sun was setting, painting the mining town in shades of blood and shadow that seemed appropriate for what they might find. But what they found wasn't destruction. It was preparation. The townspeople had barricaded the main street, creating defensive positions with wagons and barrels. Every man who could hold a rifle stood armed and ready. Women had taken children to the church for safety. And in the middle stood Sam Brennan, 68 years old and ornery as ever, coordinating defense like the Texas Ranger he'd once been. "Took you long enough," Sam said when he saw Bear, but his eyes were warm with relief. "Figured you'd come." "Where's Thorne?" "Holed up in his old store. Got there yesterday. Thought he'd find it empty. Instead found Grace and 20 townspeople waiting. We've had him surrounded since." Bear looked at the store, its windows dark, its door barricaded from inside. "How many with him?" "Just him, far as we can tell. But he's got weapons. Lots of them. And he's desperate, which makes him more dangerous than an army." Najoni moved to stand beside Sam. "What's his demand?" "Says he wants safe passage out of town. Says if we try to stop him, he'll burn the place down like his brother was supposed to before you two ruined everything." "And you've waited because?" Sam smiled grimly. "Because I knew you'd come. Because this isn't about killing him, it's about justice. And you two represent justice more than any badge ever could." As if summoned, Ezekiel Thorne's voice boomed from the store. "Hutchins, I know you're out there. Come face me like a man instead of hiding behind children and old people." Bear exchanged glances with Najoni. This was it, the final confrontation. The moment where they chose between revenge and justice, between ending Thorne permanently and proving that law actually worked. "I'm going in," Bear said. "Not alone." Najoni checked her revolver. "We started this together. We finish it together." "Actually," Sam interjected, "you're both going in, but not the way Thorne expects." He explained his plan, simple and risky, but with elegant logic that came from decades of outsmarting dangerous men. As darkness fell completely, Bear approached the front, hands visible, no weapons drawn. "Thorne, I'm coming in to talk, just talk. About time." The door cracked open, revealing Ezekiel Thorne looking nothing like the well-fed store owner who'd beaten Najoni months ago. Prison had hollowed him out, left him gaunt and wild-eyed, more dangerous because he had nothing left to lose. "Get in here before I change my mind and start shooting." Bear entered slowly, aware that Thorne held a rifle pointed at his chest. The store was wrecked, merchandise scattered, furniture overturned, the detritus of a man who'd torn apart his former kingdom looking for anything valuable enough to fund escape. "You destroyed everything," Thorne said, his voice shaking with rage. "My business, my reputation, my brother, everything I built over 20 years, gone because you couldn't mind your own business. You destroyed yourself. The moment you decided some people mattered less than your profit. The moment you raised your hand to someone weaker. The moment you chose corruption over conscience. Don't preach to me. This country was built by strong men taking what they wanted from the weak. That's how the world works." "Maybe. But that doesn't make it right." Thorne's finger tightened on the trigger. "Give me one reason I shouldn't kill you right now." "Because you're surrounded. Because even if you kill me, you're not getting out alive. And because there's someone here who deserves to face you more than I do." Najoni stepped from shadows where she'd entered through the back door, while Thorne was focused on Bear. Her revolver was drawn, pointed steady at the man who'd enslaved and beaten her for 2 years. Thorne spun, momentarily confused about which threat to address. In that second of indecision, Bear moved, knocking the rifle barrel aside and driving his fist into Thorne's gut. The fat man doubled over, gasping, and suddenly Najoni was there, her gun pressed against his temple. 2 years, she said quietly. 2 years, you owned me. beat me, made me feel like nothing, made me believe I deserved it. Her hand was steady, but tears ran down her face. I could kill you now. I'd be justified. No court would convict me. Thorne whimpered. All his bluster evaporated in the face of genuine danger. Please. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. I don't want your apology. It's worthless. Najoni's thumb moved to the hammer. The sound of it cocking was obscenely loud in the wrecked store. But I won't kill you. You know why? Because I'm not you. Because mercy is stronger than revenge. Because I choose to be better than you ever could be. She lowered the gun, stepped back, and let federal marshals who'd followed from Santa Fe enter to take Thorne into custody, properly this time, with enough guards to ensure he'd never escape again. As Thorne was dragged away screaming threats nobody bothered listening to, the town of Copper Ridge erupted in celebration. The siege was over. The monster who'd terrorized them was gone. And the people who'd stood up to him had proven that sometimes courage was contagious. The celebration lasted through the night, but Bear and Najoni slipped away after the first hour, needing quiet and each other more than music and crowds. They walked to the edge of town, where the desert stretched away under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. "Are you okay?" Bear asked, holding her as she shook with aftermath of confronting Thorne. "I will be." Najoni looked up at him. "I wanted to kill him. In that moment, I wanted it more than I've wanted anything. But then I remembered what Red Skywalker said, about choices, about who we decide to be, and I chose to be someone Emily would be proud of, someone Sarah would respect." Bear's throat tightened. "They would be proud. I'm proud." "Good. Because I need you to be proud of me when I'm not sure I'm proud of myself yet." They stood together under indifferent stars. Two people who'd been broken by life and cruelty but had somehow found a way to be whole together. Tomorrow they would leave Copper Ridge forever, riding east toward North Carolina and a cabin in the mountains where they could build something new. But tonight they had this: the knowledge that they'd done the right thing even when the wrong thing would have been easier. They left at dawn the next morning, just as they'd promised themselves. The federal marshals took Ezekiel Thorne back to the same prison that held his brother Jonas, but this time to a cell reserved for men who'd already proven that mercy was wasted on them. Sam Brennan walked them to the edge of town, his limp more pronounced than usual but his spirits higher than Bear had ever seen. "You two did something remarkable," Sam said, gripping Bear's hand. "You showed this town that standing up matters, that one person caring can change everything." "You're the one who started it," Bear replied. "We just finished what you began." Sam shook his head. "No, son. I gathered evidence. You gave people hope. There's a difference." They rode east as the sun climbed higher, leaving Arizona territory behind with its dust and memories and hard-won victories. Najoni looked back only once, at the mountains that had sheltered her people for generations. Then she turned forward, toward mountains that waited with different promises. "No regrets?" Bear asked. "None," she said, and meant it. The journey took 2 months. They traveled slowly, stopping in towns along the way, sometimes working odd jobs to stretch their funds, sometimes simply resting because they could. They watched summer fade into autumn, felt the air grow cooler as they climbed into higher elevations, and somewhere along the road through Texas and Arkansas and Tennessee, the weight they'd both been carrying began to lift. By the time they reached North Carolina, they were different people than the ones who'd fled Copper Ridge in the night. Stronger, lighter, free. 6 months later, spring painted the North Carolina mountains in every shade of green that existed. 6 months later, spring painted the North Carolina mountains in every shade of green that existed. Bear's cabin, which had sat empty for 5 years, now showed signs of life and love. Smoke rose from the chimney. A garden grew beside the porch, full of herbs Najoni had planted. And inside, warmth filled spaces that had been silent too long. Najoni stood at the window, one hand resting on her swelling belly, watching Bear chop wood in the yard. A rider approached, and she recognized Chaska before Bear did. The Apache warrior had promised to visit when spring made the journey possible. "My sister," Chaska called in Apache. "You've grown fat and lazy in this soft country." "And you've grown stupid and loud," she shouted back, laughing. That evening around a fire Bear built outside the cabin, Chaska shared news from Arizona. Copper Ridge had elected Sam Brennan as mayor, and the old ranger was driving everyone crazy with his reforms. Grace Hartwell had expanded her boarding house and was teaching Apache children to read while they taught her their language. The White Mountain Apache were thriving on their restored lands, building a future that honored their past. Red Sky Walker had come too, making the long journey despite his age because he said he needed to see how the mountain and the wind were faring in their new home. The old medicine man sat wrapped in a blanket, his ancient eyes reflecting firelight. "You have built something good here," he said to Bear and Najoni. "Not just a home, but a bridge, between worlds, between peoples, between what was and what could be." He produced a small leather pouch, worn smooth by age. Inside were two items, a lock of white hair and a turquoise stone. "The hair belonged to your mother," he told Najoni. "I saved it when she passed, knowing someday you'd want something to pass to your children. Tell them about Moondancer. Tell them she was strong and brave and loved her daughter more than life." Najoni took the pouch with trembling hands, tears streaming. "Thank you, grandfather." Red Sky Walker turned to Bear. "And you, Mountain Man, you have spent years carrying guilt for deaths you could not prevent. Let it go. Sarah and Emily would not want their memory to be an anchor. Let them be wings that remind you to soar." Later, as everyone slept and only the fire remained awake, Bear and Najoni sat on their porch holding hands and watching stars wheel overhead. A coyote sang somewhere in darkness. An owl asked its question of the night. "Do you ever regret?" Najoni asked quietly. "Choosing this quiet life?" "Every day," Bear said, and felt her tense. Then he smiled. "I regret that I didn't do it sooner, that I wasted 5 years being dead when I could have been living, that I almost missed you." She relaxed against him. "Good answer." "What should we name her?" Najoni asked. "How do you know it's a girl?" "The women in my family know these things." Bear thought about Sarah and Emily, about love lost and love found. "If it's a girl, Ruth Margaret." Ruth was Emily's middle name. Margaret was Sarah's mother. "And if it's a boy?" "Dakota, after the warrior who helped save our lives." Najoni smiled, placing his hand on her belly where their child kicked. "Both sound good. Both honor the past while facing the future. Like us." They sat until the fire burned to embers and the eastern sky began to lighten with promise of dawn. They had survived corruption and violence, had faced down evil and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. And now they had this, a cabin in the mountains, a child on the way, and the rest of their lives stretching ahead like an unmarked trail through beautiful country. As the sun crested the ridge and painted their cabin in gold, Bear pulled Najoni close and whispered words he said every morning, "I choose you, today and always." And Najoni, who'd survived slavery and found freedom, who'd known cruelty and chosen mercy, whispered back, "I choose you too, Mountain Man, now and forever." The future stretched ahead, unknown and unknowable, but they would face it together, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time, and that was enough, that was everything.